All the body panels have been removed from the vehicle and repaired. I intend to start preparing those for paint. Now that's a long and involved process, and to prepare the panels properly, I mean, there's a couple of options you have. Panels like this, you could probably sandblast. You can't dip them because they've got timber in them, but you could probably sandblast, or you can mechanically remove the rust. Well, mechanically removing is a lot harder, a lot more time consuming, but it's a process that I've always taken. I've never sandblasted, and that's just my preference. And probably a few reasons for that is, one, to find a good sandblaster, and then getting them there, getting them back. There's a lot of panels to be done, and I find it a lot easier just to mechanically prepare each panel as I go. These aren't properly prepared for paint yet. I've removed most of the paint and most of the rust. I'll do a final rub over before I consider putting any undercoat on. Now, in terms of paint, I'll be using acrylic. It's probably a better paint for a DIY person to use. It's less toxic than the 2-pack. Can you get as good a finish? Well, I believe it's probably close. The difference is the acrylic is a softer paint. It's not as stain resistant as the 2-packs. This panel here, this is done in acrylic. That paint is 6 years old. Prepared the way I prepare all panels, no sandblasting, just mechanical preparation. Some people may say, oh, that's not sufficient, that rust will eventually come through. Well, perhaps it will eventually come through, but it's a question of how long it will take. Now, with my vehicles, I don't leave them outside in the weather. They're always garaged, so they're not as subject to as much wear and tear on the paint as a normal day-use vehicle that's left out in the sun, left out in the weather and elements. So I've found that the paint lasts quite well. As I say, this paint here is 6 years old, and I'll just go to the other side of the garage and show you one that's 27 years old. This car I painted 27 years ago. No sandblasting, mechanically removed all of the paint, any rust, killed the rust with phosphoric acid, and it's held up really quite well for 27 years. Okay, it's not outside for 27 years, but as I say, it's the way you use them. I keep them clean, I keep them waxed. Bodies like this tend to crack eventually, mainly because these bodies are actually timber framed and they flex a lot, so panels do flex. But even so, the panels are intact, paint is still quite shiny and serviceable. Obviously you get a few chips in 27 years, but all in all, I think it's a paint that's certainly easier for a DIY to use, and you can end up with a very, very good finish. Now, can you get a better final coat with a professional painter? Yes, you can, if you get a good professional painter. And I'm not talking about the standard smash repair. If you get a top spray painter, they will provide a finish that's second to none. But in a DIY situation, you can actually get a finish which is more than acceptable, and is probably better than a lot of the new cars that come out of the showroom. And the reason for that is that when I prepare the paint, I I spent a lot of time flattening the final finish, which you can do with acrylic. You can make mistakes and you can make up any final corrections in the final cutting back process. But painting is a long and involved process, which I'll record as we go through. Preparing panels for paint sometimes takes longer than actually repairing the panel itself. What you have to make sure of is that the surface is completely flat, because if it's not, when you finally put the final coat of paint on, you'll actually see the imperfections in the surface underneath. So what appears flat may not necessarily be flat, as in this panel here. Now, okay, I repaired this along the bottom. There's some undulations there that have to be filled, but that's not the only problem. There are also slight depressions in the panel that you can feel as you run your hand across it, and usually the hand is the best way to find any imperfections. So what I've done, and what I tend to do, is I use polyester filler and fill the slight depressions. Now, it's only a very thin layer in places, it's not very thick. Although I have seen in the past in cars that I've repaired, and when I've found older repairs, I've found polyester filler that's probably up to an inch thick. I've also found polyester filler used to fill up rust holes, where first of all you stick a bit of newspaper in and then cover it with filler. So it can be misused, but so long as it's used properly, it's a good way to flatten out the panel. It's a long process. You put a lot of filler on, and as you can see here, you rub a lot, if not most of it, back off. So you put a thin layer on, you rub it off. You put a thin layer on, you rub it off till you get it flat. Now this panel is still not quite flat. There's a few slight imperfections I can feel with my hand. So what I'll do is I'll apply another very thin layer and then rub it off again. So when I can rub my hand across the panel and not feel any imperfection, then I'll be ready to start applying the undercoats. But that's a reasonable time off at this stage, because I've got a few panels that I'm preparing at the same time. So I like to do a fair bit of a filling on just not one panel but a few panels, and then I'll start undercoating. I've just put 3 coats of primer surfacer on actually all of the doors and the boot. The preparation of the panel was as good as I could get it at that stage, so I thought I'd put some primer on, etch primer, and then this primer filler. What I'll be doing now is just spraying a guide coat on that. Some leftover paint I've got, so it's actually British racing green, but it'll just a dusting coat over the top, which will enable me then to flat the panel. Now, even though you feel the panel with your hand, it feels flat. I can see that just by the difference in shading on the door where the light's shining on it, that it's definitely not flat. So it's going to take a bit of filling with primer filler and so on till I get it flat. So it'll be spraying fillers on, rubbing them off, on, off, on, off, and this is the slow process of any paint job. But if you don't do it, the end result will be that the paint will be uneven. So I'll just keep persisting until I get it to the standard that I'm happy with. and that has a guide coat on it, and it's only very light dusting. Now what I will do is use a very large block, and I'll block it back, and what you find is that the reason for the guide coat is that when you're rubbing it, you'll see that the high spots will be rubbed back to primer, and the low spots will be the green tint, so it enables you to find out where the highs and lows are in the panel.